Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming to, February's Inland SoCal Housing Collective meeting. We have two speakers here today, and so our first is Russell King. He is a professional mechanical engineer licensed in 3 states. He has more than 30 years of experience in the areas of HVAC design, diagnostics, and consulting, as well as energy code compliance, HERS certification, and consulting. He has taught professional level training on all these topics, and he's currently the CEO and founder of Coded Energy Inc. and developers of Model 3D user interface for HVAC design and energy modeling software. So the Inland SoCal Housing Collective has a special partnership with I-REN to ensure that our region has the education that we need around energy code updates, to ensure that what we're doing, that education reaches all our contractors, our developers, our cities, to ensure that we're ready for the rollout of new codes and standards that are coming. So I asked Russ to come and talk a little bit to give us a little snippet. But our partnership with I-REN has actually a series of classes and training that has been going on this past year and will continue to go on. And so this is we invited Russ to come, who is one of the instructors, to share a little snippet, right, of this, to give us a little taste of some of the information that we should be looking for and be adapting and looking how this can impact our work in housing. So, Russ?
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Appreciate it. Well, thank you for inviting me and having me here today. So this is one of several classes that I teach for I-REN, and I also teach for Bay-REN and 3C-REN and other things. As Melanie mentioned, my background is HVAC and the energy code. I'm very well versed in the energy code, but I will admit that electrification is not exactly my strongest suit, but I understand the principles and what goes into it. And I think what the energy code is doing is very, very important. On the electrification side, if you have a question about heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, I can absolutely answer those questions. But anyways, let's dive into the topics. I'm going to tell you right up front that this is normally a 90-minute presentation that's been trimmed down to less than half an hour. So, and there's still way too many slides in it, but so I'm going to go fast. I'm going to give you a flavor for it, and then feel free. And Millie, they're welcome to get a copy of these slides later on too. So let's dive in. So today's learning objectives is to understand the current electrification landscape, to learn about common technologies under all electric design, understand the opportunities to reduce emissions, and understand how code applies to all electric buildings under the 2022 energy code and other codes. And then we'll talk a little bit about what changed for the 2022 code. Okay. So the landscape, electrification, energy code, key electrification takeaways, and then I doubt we'll have much time at the end for Q&A, but we'll try. Okay. So, all right. So climate crisis is a key today. And if you look at gas use by residential, 67% of gas use comes from water heating and space heating in the residential sector. Okay. So there's been a big push to convert space heating gas furnaces into heat pumps and to convert gas water heaters to heat pump water heaters. So heat pump technology is key. And one of the interesting things about heat pump technology is that it is all electric, but it's actually way more efficient than the old electric, which was electric resistance. So heat pumps can actually be 300% efficient. And you might go, well, how is that even possible? And it's possible because if it's 300% efficient compared to electric resistance, which is 100% efficient at converting electricity to heat. Okay. Electric resistance heating is about 100% efficient at converting electricity to heat. The problem is that electricity is very expensive, and we can't compete with gas on a BTU per BTU basis using electric resistance. Heat pumps don't create heat, they move heat from one place to another. So they can use 1 unit of electricity and move 3 units of heat. So they're 300% efficient. Now we can start competing with gas on a cost effectiveness basis. Okay. And I have a whole class I teach on heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and stuff like that. So it's very interesting technology, and it's come a long ways. The code, there's lots and lots of codes. California has all kinds of codes. The important thing on this slide is that the energy code is Title 24, Part 6. Okay, that's the California Energy Code. This is sort of the state's plan for reaching carbon neutrality. So each one of these little steps represents a code cycle. We are currently in the 2022 code cycle. And one of the goals for the 2022 code cycle was to make homes be zero net energy. They didn't quite get there, and it had to do with cost effectiveness, but they're very, very, very close. Okay. If you build a new home in California today, it's almost as efficient as it can possibly be. So we're very, very close to Z&E for new homes. The goal for commercial buildings is the 2031 code, is to make commercial buildings zero net energy. And then the goal by 2045 is to be completely carbon neutral, to be basically running off of renewable energy and things like that. Okay. This is just kind of, and this is like the mandate that's been put on the Energy Commission. So every time they write a new code, they're thinking about these goals and reaching these goals. Okay. One of the big ones between 2019 and 2022 was, well, so in 2013, we adopted a new software that everything is based on, the energy code and energy compliance is based on this software that has all the assumptions in it. In 2016, they gave a credit in your house for having PVs on the house. In 2019, they required PVs on low-rise residential. And then the big thing in 2022 is they really emphasize heat pumps technology. They increased the requirements for PV and batteries in 2022. And then you're gonna see those sorts of things happen each time we go through a code cycle. So the reason you're going to see more electrification is it's a state goal. Okay, it's written into the building code. Plus, there's a lot of local ordinances that are trying to do basically the same thing. So there's over 70 jurisdictions have adopted electrification reach codes, and a reach code is something that's on top of the code. There's a lot of increased incentives, tax and financing that are all targeting electrification and heat pumps, and they are throwing a lot of money at people to get them to switch over to heat pumps, and I think personally that's a good thing. So the benefits of electrification is there's climate benefits for emission reduction. There's health benefits for indoor air quality, outdoor air quality, and just general safety. A big one for me, being an HVAC designer, is safety. It's always made me a little nervous to design a gas furnace system in a house, knowing that they're going to pipe explosive gas into their house. And then when that gas is used, it becomes a poisonous gas. And so health and safety has always been high on my priority list when I design heating and cooling systems. And so heat pumps are much safer than any kind of gas appliance. And that's sort of my emphasis. There's a big cost benefit now for switching to heat pumps in all electric homes. When you start looking at homes that have their own PV system on them, it's kind of a no-brainer. There's a lower first cost for all electric homes. When I first started doing energy consulting back in 1988, every builder wanted to build all electric subdivisions. Everyone, there's let's build all electric, but the code was such that it actually encouraged gas back then for cost effectiveness reasons. Well, now our priority has changed and we're going back to all electric, and now builders can build all electric homes, and they're seeing they're realizing the benefits, that it's a lot cheaper to do in terms of infrastructure. There's less penetrations on your roof. You don't have to pipe gas in. You don't have to have vents on your appliances and all that other stuff. Okay, and then of course incentives also help tilt everything in the right direction. Some considerations to have in order for electrification to happen is awareness and consumer education. Very, very important, as well as contractor education. I run into contractors almost on a daily basis who are actively trying to convince homeowners not to install heat pumps, and that's because they don't know that much about them. That they don't do good design work. They've installed heat pumps, their homeowners weren't happy, and they're blaming it on the heat pumps. One of the downsides of heat pumps is they are very susceptible to bad design. Okay, so training contractors how to install them correctly is a big deal. Once they do that, it's fine. And heat pumps are great. Heat pumps will work in any climate. Um, California is a perfect climate for heat pumps. Um, we need to change the business as usual design practices and get them to start doing it correctly. HVAC contractors, they don't want to do a good design to begin with because it takes time and nobody's actually paying them to do it. And now we're telling them that they really, really need to. And so we need to encourage them and train them how to do it correctly. Infrastructure, running gas lines and stuff like that, that's a big deal. But infrastructure for electricity, there is some still issues along those lines as well. Initial capital costs for existing homes, variable rate structures impact operational costs. Back in the day, it used to be really easy to calculate cost effectiveness for electrical stuff because there was pretty much two rates that you had to worry about. Now there's like 6 or 7 rates, and they vary throughout the day. So just calculating cost effectiveness is a lot more complicated than it used to be. Okay. All right. Some technologies. The first and foremost technology that we really, really need to embrace is energy efficiency. It's not really a technology. It's more like common sense. One of my favorite sayings is the largest source of energy that we have in the United States, the largest energy source that we have in the United States is not gas, it's not coal, it's not solar, it's not wind. The largest energy resource we have in the United States is the energy we waste. Okay. So if we can capture that energy and bring it back, that's like finding an entirely new type of energy. It's out there, it's there. We just need to reach out and grab it. Okay. So energy efficiency is very important. Being more efficient cuts energy consumption, it reduces costs, it does everything that we want and still uses less energy. Okay. So energy efficiency should always be our first goal. Then once we do that, now we can start looking at the energy, how we use the energy. Okay. So as far as mixed fuel gas, we've got gas furnaces, we've got gas cooking, we've got gas water heating, whether it's storage or tankless, and then we got gas dryers and gas pool heats. So these are all fairly common. Okay. But every single one of those can be replaced with an electronic technology. So heat pump technology for space heating, heat pumps for water heating, electric cooking, electric stoves, induction cooktops, and all that stuff. They have heat pump dryers and they have heat pump pool heaters as well. All of that technology can be replaced with electric appliances. The other big thing is photovoltaics and batteries. Photovoltaics have come a long way. Batteries have come a really long way in terms of making us more off the grid, if you will. Back when I was in college, there was, when you talked about solar, it was all about being off the grid, where you weren't even connected to the utility at all. You produce all your own electricity. You were completely independent. We're kind of getting there in our everyday houses now, and so we've got photovoltaics. We've got these great big batteries that, if the power does run out, we can run off those batteries for days. You can plug your Ford electric truck in your house and run off of that for days too. So these have really, really come a long ways. And one of the big things is that those those sort of help take the spikes off the grid. Okay. It's like a shock absorber between the use pattern and the production of electricity. Back in the old days, if you were to look at electric use during the day, there was this huge spike in the morning and then an even bigger spike in the afternoon. And the power grid has to handle those spikes. Well, now if we can rely on PV and batteries, we can squish those spikes down. So now what the power grid is seeing is a much more level demand, and that helps a lot. Okay. EVs, of course, have all their own benefits as well. So let's talk about the green code and electrification. Okay, the green code is part 11, Title 24, part 11. And when we talk about the green code as well as the energy code, it's important to understand that California is divided into 16 climate zones. Cost effectiveness of an energy feature depends on the climate. Okay. Putting an energy feature on your house up in Truckee is going to have very different energy savings than putting an energy feature on your house in Palm Desert. Right. So you have to look at the climate of the location before you start calculating cost effectiveness. And to do that fairly, the state has divided itself into 16 distinct climate zones. And so the Inland Empire is made up of 10, 14, 15, and 16. Okay. And those all occur in both of the big counties down here. But what's very interesting is 16 is the coldest climate zone in California, and 15 is the hottest climate zone in California, and they're right next to each other. So that always poses some interesting questions. That doing something in climate zone 16, or let me put it this way, something might be required in 16 that's not required in 15. Because it's cost effective in 16, but it's not cost effective in 15. So you have to know the climate zone that you're in when you start talking about the energy codes. There's a lot of climate zone dependent requirements in the energy code. So Title 24, moving towards zero net energy, what the energy code is going to accomplish or attempting to accomplish is starting off with efficiency. Make your house efficient first, okay? Increased performance of the enclosure. The envelope is more efficient. The mechanical system is more efficient. And the other uses such as lighting and appliances is more efficient. So first of all, use less energy, okay? And then put a PV system on that house. And the more efficient the house is, the smaller the PV system needs to be, okay? And the better the battery system will work once you put that on as well. So through a combination of efficiency first, photovoltaics, and then optional but encouraged battery systems, we're shooting for the Title 24 goals that we're going to have. And you're going to see those get more and more strict at each code cycle. So complying with the code is easier for electric buildings in the 2016 code than it was in the 2016 code. We're in the 2022 code, okay? And it is a lot easier to make an electric building comply than it was. They've changed the way some of the code requirements work. If you're building a new house, the way you show compliance to a new house is by comparing it to something called the standard house. Okay. The standard house is what the Energy Commission thinks is the most cost-effective way to build a house. So you compare your house to the standard house, and you can actually use a computer simulation model, and you model both of those, and you say, okay, I'm going to do this to my house. As long as my house uses the same or less energy as a standard house, I can demonstrate compliance. So it really, really matters what you're being compared to. In the previous codes, you were being compared to a house that had gas heat, gas space heating, and gas water heating. Now you're being compared to a house that has electric space heating and electric water heating, which makes it easier for you to comply if that's what your house is. Okay. And so they've come up with some, I don't want to call them penalties, but there's some things that have to be done in order to meet the same greenhouse gas requirements, to offset the greenhouse gas requirements. Let me put it that way. So it's very complicated, but just so you know, they've sort of adjusted the target that we're shooting for, and that's one of the reasons why it's easier to make an electric house comply these days than it was in the past. So what's new for 2022? So we're currently in the 2022 code. It was adopted in 2022. It went into effect on January 1st of 2023. So we're just a little over a year into this code. And what changed for that code was basically all the stuff I was talking about. Encourage electric heat pump technology. This is kind of interesting. If you build a new house, you can put gas heating in that house. You can put a gas furnace and you can put a gas water heater. Okay, you can do that. But what they require that you do is make it easy to upgrade to heat pump in the future. Okay, if you're building a house today, that house is going to be here for a long, long time. And sometime in the next few years, are probably going to want to switch to electric from gas. Okay. Either they're going to come up with a new technology or the price of electricity is going to go down or something, but it's pretty darn sure that in the next few years, most people are going to want to switch to electric. The time to plan for that is now while you're building your house. So if you build a house that has gas heating in it, you have to put in the infrastructure so that you can upgrade to electric without too much work. And that's just common sense. That's just a smart thing to do. Okay. All right. They're going to expand solar and photovoltaic, and they're going to strengthen ventilation standards. One of the downsides to becoming more efficient is that houses are becoming more and more tight. Okay. And the more tight you make an envelope, the easier it is for pollutants to build up inside that envelope. And so they've done a lot of studies, a lot of research on where are those pollutants coming from, what kind of pollutants are they, and how do we get rid of them. And so as the energy efficiency requirements get more and more strict, you're going to start seeing the ventilation requirements starting to get more and more strict as well, to keep the indoor air quality safe. And that's all a good thing. That's all a good thing. So the big picture goals for 2022: encourage heat pump, establish electric ready homes, expand the PV requirements, and strengthen ventilation standards. So that's pretty much what we're dealing with right now today. And then for the next code cycle, which is the 2025 code cycle, you're just going to see those things become a little bit more emphasized, if you will. Okay. So this diagram kind of shows how the energy code works, and it's kind of interesting. The first thing is we have what's called mandatory measures. So let's say you're building a house, or let's say you're adding on to a house, or let's say you're replacing the heating and cooling system in a house. There's something called mandatory measures. Those are things that are just deemed so important and so cost effective, they just always have to be done. For example, sealing ducts. Okay. If you replace an air conditioner in a house, you have to seal the ducts. It's kind of stupid not to. Okay. So that's a mandatory measure. And then there's other things called prescriptive measures, and that's just a list of features that they want you to do, but you have a choice. The prescriptive path is very simple, but it's also very strict. And a lot of people have looked at the prescriptive path and say, I can achieve the same level of efficiency, but use different features. And so a long time ago, they said, okay, that's fine. Prove to us that you can build the house a different way and still use the same amount of energy, and we'll let you do that. And so they developed something called the performance path. The performance path allows trade-offs between different measures in a house. The prescriptive path restricts how many windows you can put on a house, how much glass you can have in a house. And architects are like, oh, that's crazy. I want way more houses. I want way more glass in my house than that. And what if I make the rest of my house so much better? Can I put more glass in my house? And they said, sure, use the performance path, prove to us that your house will be just as efficient, and we'll let you do that. Okay. So you really have two choices. You have the prescriptive, which is simple but strict, and you have the performance path, which is very complicated but very flexible. Okay. So those are your two choices. And then after all that is said and done, depending on where you are, you may also have reach codes that you have to deal with on top of that. Okay. So that's sort of the structure of the code cycle, or sorry, of the code compliance path, if you will. Okay. Then within that, we have different kinds of projects. Okay. An alteration is a fairly straightforward, it's basically a change to an existing house. So good examples like that is you re-roof your house. That's an alteration. If you put new windows on your house, that's an alteration. If you replace the heating and cooling system, that's an alteration. If you replace the water heating system, those are all alterations. Those are fairly straightforward, and those all follow the prescriptive path. Okay. Now, when you're adding on to a house, when you're making the house bigger, there's more comes into play. You start creating conditioned space, you start adding surface area, you start adding walls and windows and things like that. So an addition is when you make the house bigger. And those can either fall under the prescriptive path or the performance path. It depends on the complexity of the addition. All of these things will trigger energy codes. Some of the big things that trigger the energy codes are replacing HVAC, water heating, and windows. Okay. In fact, some of those will actually trigger third-party verification called a HERS rater, which means you have to have that work inspected by a special inspector. That would be the HVAC stuff. Okay. So all of this is just kind of different types of alterations and how the energy code addresses those things. Let's talk about some more technologies. Let's see, space heating, water heating, PV, EV charging. I think this is very similar to the slide we just saw, but let's focus on water heating for a second. So heat pump water heaters, they've actually been around for a long time, but it's only been in the last 10 years or so that they've really become popular. Um, the way it works is it has basically a little air conditioning unit on top of it. You see this vent up here, and it brings in outside air and it extracts heat from that air. And it extracts that heat and it condenses it and it puts it into the water, therefore heating the water. So it's very efficient. Um, there's different kinds of water heaters. There's the integrated, where the little condenser sits on top of the tank. These are most common by far, but there's also some that are a little more efficient and a little more powerful, if you will. And they're called split systems, where they take the condenser and they actually separate it. And then this can go outside, and then the storage tank can basically sit anywhere inside the house. Integrated is by far the most common, but you'll even see different kinds of these. Most of the ones you'll see will have a vent on the side, and they're taking heat, they're taking air from the space that they're located in, but they also make them where these are ducted. So you can actually pull air out of your attic and extract heat from it and then blow the cold air out somewhere else. So there's a lot of different kinds of heat pump water heaters. As far as space heating goes, HVAC, this is what I deal with on a daily basis. Um, there's a lot of different kinds of equipment. When you install equipment, there's a lot of different tests that have to be done. There's a lot of things they look for. The first one is the efficiency of the piece of equipment. And then there's some other things that they test that are actually performance related. So they'll measure the fan watt draw to make sure the ducts are properly sized. A lot of different stuff for HVAC, a lot of tests and stuff like that. I mentioned how important design is, that you do a proper design. The standard for proper design is right here, ACA Manual J, S, and D, or J, D, and S. Um, it is Manual J is load calculations, Manual D is duct design, and Manual S is equipment selection. Those are required by code. The problem is that they're not well enforced by the building departments. Most building departments don't know what to ask for HVAC design, and when they get it, they don't know what to check. So we actually have a specific class on training building departments how to check HVAC design. Ducting, super important. Um, Ducting systems must meet HERS testing for leakage and duct insulation, and then also sizing requirements. Manual D will tell you how big the ducts need to be in order to properly distribute the air and get the efficiency that you want. There's some other things. Filtration in California, you have to have at least MERV 13 on your filtration. The problem with that is MERV 13 restricts airflow. So now you got to make your filters bigger in order to not restrict airflow and not affect your Manual JS&D design. It all gets factored in to the process. The code affects the thermostats that we use. And then if you want to have a heat pump, it's fairly common to put on what they call emergency heat or backup heat, which is just electric resistance. You can size a heat pump in California that will handle 100% of the heating load. But historically, what they used to do is they would size the heat pump to the cooling load and then make up the difference with electric resistance strips. Well, that was back when electricity was cheap, and it's not cheap anymore. So now they want people to focus more on sizing the heat pump to handle the total load. And then you look at the air conditioning and make sure that it's not oversized for air conditioning. So that all goes into Manual S. All right. Photovoltaics and I'm just a little bit over time. I still got a bunch of slides to go. I will wrap it up here pretty quick. All right, so photovoltaics and battery, PV, minimum requirements for low-rise residential, no requirements for high-rise residential. So if you build a low-rise residential house, you've got to put PV on it. There are some exceptions related to shading and some things like that. And then if you put a battery on there, you get extra credit to help you comply with the energy code. Okay. Let's see. Let me get to this. Is all just details on solar stuff. Electric vehicles, they kind of are what they are. There's a lot of different types of charging stations and stuff for electric vehicles. And I think let me just do the key electrification takeaways. So what you're probably going to
Yes.
see for an all electric project is, or for most new construction projects anyways, is all electric. Okay. Um,
Well,
a
pass
lot
the
of
passage on.
single appliance
Yeah,
upgrades
follow.
for going to the electric stoves and all that good stuff. Full energy efficiency and electrification retrofits for existing homes, and then you're going to see a lot of solar panels going on new projects. Okay. What does this mean? Electrical location, equipment location comes into play. Bundling of scopes of work of different trades is going to be important. Panels will be upgraded to accommodate new loads or future loads. Your electric panel is a big deal these days. If you go electric, you may have to upgrade your panel. That can be very expensive. Load sharing technologies. These are kind of cool. There's special load sharing breakers that go on your panel that where you can have your EV charger and your dryer on the same circuit, and it will say, "Oh, you need to dry your clothes. Okay, we'll let the dryer run." And then when the dryer's done, it says, "Okay, let's go back to charging the EV." And by using those, you can avoid upgrading your panel in some cases. And then, of course, removing gas meters is always a good thing. Some best practices: considered combined permits for heat pump water heaters and electrical, kind of because those two things are going to have to happen. A lot of building departments, if you upgrade to a heat pump water heater, it's a combined permit for both the plumbing and the electrical side of it. Evaluate the process to expedite permitting and minimizing permit costs. Understand the intersection of different codes for electrification technologies and identify those at plan check, and consider items that could be confirmed at install so as not to hold up permit approval. All right. Whew. There you go.
Thank you. I know that we gave you a big undertaking to condense what I think, yeah, like 80, 90 slides into this, just like to nearly half of that. So, Russ, I appreciate you coming and sharing a little bit about this and just kind of giving us a perspective on how this might impact the work that we do. There were some questions that were dropped in here, and I'm hoping if you have time to stick around to maybe just go back and look and see if you could do that offline on chat. And if not, then I'll take those down and I'll loop back with you and get those questions asked. But it was a little bit more, the questions were pertaining to uh, the group and our work with focusing on the creation and preservation of affordable housing. So it was pertaining to that scope and not just
Yep.
market rate housing. So we'll loop those back in, and if you can't answer them through chat, then we can connect offline and I'll get those to you. But I thought it was really important because we have city staff members on here, that communicate with their team, that communicate with their planners, inspectors, permitters, that they hear this information so they can loop their staff, their team into the training and education work that I-REN does, and you as the instructor for them, and as well as our developers that are a part of this, our smaller and larger developers and their contractors, and as they look at new projects, what this may entail, and some of them might already know, but and then also the redevelopment work that many of our developers do in terms of just owner occupied rehab and what that work might entail with alterations or and especially since there's a focus on health and safety, what implications that has on cost and certifications of our general contractors and our electricians that work with us on our housing work. So I thought that all tied together greatly. So I know that we also have Cassie, who's on the call, who's been helping answer some questions in the chat. And so I think she may have already done it, but Cassie, if you would like to drop the link of any upcoming classes, this is an ongoing series that the collective is promoting, that we've been sending to different partners based on the audience that we see for each class. But if this is something that you and your team feel, or your contractor, list of contractors or planners need to be on, please check out the information or look at our newsletters for further information on that training and credits that your team and folks can get from that. So, Russ, thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'll go through and answer what I can, and then the ones that I can, if you can't answer them, get them to us, and we'll give us some time, and we can answer them separately.
Okay. Was someone going to jump in?
Oh, I was
Okay.
just going to say, this is
Okay.
Cassie from I-REN. I did drop the link to our solar PV training that's happening tomorrow, 9 to 10:30 a.m. All of our trainings are 90 minutes and usually the last fourth or the last Thursday of the month. This one is being taught by the California Energy Commission. So the people who make the rules are going to come tell you about them. I dropped the registration link in there. And if you want to know more about solar PV, battery storage, especially in the current standards, then please come join us. Thanks.
Thank you. And so we're going to transition, kind of a pivot, but very pertinent information to our audit, to our collective members. So this month, again, we have folks from Rise Economy who are going to be coming and sharing with us about the CRA updates. We have Doni and Kevin who will be presenting. Do I need to? Doni, I made you a presenter. Is that correct? Or do I need a co-host, or is it Kevin?
Yeah, that's perfect. I'll be sharing slides.
Perfect. Okay. Awesome. So Kevin Stein here from Rise Economy, formerly known as Cal Reinvest. And he is their chief of legal and strategy. And so I asked him, I think a couple months ago with the CRA, I'm like, hey, do you have a handle on it? We're trying to figure, we'd love to get some expert advice. When I think of CRA, I think of Kevin, I think of Rise Economy. So I went to him to the source to say, hey, could you present kind of the updates, highlights to the Inland SoCal Housing Collective and see, hey, what do we need to pay attention to? What are some of those big updates that has happened this past year when they released it in October? So Kevin, thank you for coming on and sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're really happy to be with you all. It's good to see you. And Melanie, for your birthday, I thought it would be good to I pulled Doni into the conversation. So Doni's going to start us off actually and provide some context. Maybe CRA is well known to some people and not so much for others. So we'll kind of ease our way into the new federal rules. Doni, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. So as Kevin mentioned, I'll be providing just some context, a brief primer on the CRA, our work with the CRA, what we've been able to kind of achieve with the federal CRA, and then Kevin will get into the new rules, and then we'll talk about some of our companion campaigns that flow out of that might flow out of this discussion. So to start, the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, some folks might know this comes from the kind of tail end of the civil rights movement. As one of the last big pieces of policy to come out of that era. And it was enacted to combat redlining, or the disinvestment from communities of color and the denial of credit to communities of color and low to moderate income communities. And it said that banks have this affirmative obligation to help meet community credit needs, including low to moderate income communities. And after this was passed, rules throughout the years have set out how the federal banking regulators, the OCC, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve, how they will evaluate and rate banks on their ability of meeting these credit needs. This includes evaluations of how well they are originating mortgages, small business loans, affordable housings, lending investments, other forms of economic development, the number of branches or the kinds of branches they have in low to moderate income communities, and the kinds of accounts that they provide. And through the CRA, there are these things called community benefits agreements that banks can enter into with community groups, where they spell out how they will meet these needs. So how the CRA works, this is kind of an overview. There are these three federal banking regulators: the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the OCC, or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And there are sort of two main inflection points where the CRA is implemented. The first one is that banks are evaluated periodically every 2 to 3 years for their performance. and they're given various ratings, outstanding to substantial non-compliance. And then what's supposed to happen is that these evaluations are meant to be used to, one, determine if banks are sufficiently meeting the needs of their community. And then when banks are seeking to expand, whether that is opening new branches or merging with another banks, the regulators are meant to take this into account as they're processing those applications. Community input is a really important part of the CRA. The public can provide comments when banks are being evaluated in their periodic evaluations. And then also during bank mergers, there are these comment periods where community groups and the public can voice their concerns, their thoughts around these mergers. Unfortunately, the federal CRA, there's a decent amount of grade inflation there. As you can see, 96% of banks get a passing CRA rating, and that is outstanding or satisfactory. I think folks would probably agree that if 96% of banks were meeting the community credit needs of their communities, a lot of us might have different jobs or be working in different fields. And so we've been working through our advocacy work, entering into community benefits agreements with banks to make sure that they are actually meeting those needs. And maybe we'll talk about this more later, but there are some other areas where the CRA can be strengthened, and maybe I'll cover that more in another slide. And so as it stands, the federal CRA has yielded quite a lot of benefits to California communities. Just in our advocacy with banks since 2021, in fact, we've negotiated over $100 billion in community benefits agreements for banks. And on the right, you can see these are the mergers that resulted in these CBAs. And in our CBAs are a variety of different kinds of lending, investments, and financial services that banks can do to meet the needs of their communities. One of which is this thing called special purpose credit programs. We've negotiated 9 of them throughout our bank agreements. And basically, these special purpose credit programs are specialized lending products, investment products that banks can create to address particular credit access gaps for various communities. So if they are trying to increase homeownership in Black and Latinx communities, they can create a specialized program that maybe has more favorable rates, better down payment assistance programs, and more competitive terms to kind of spur homeownership rates within communities that have been historically excluded from it. And they can do this with a particular focus on communities, on these protected like classes of folks, without fear of having any sort of fair lending or ECOA violations. And the federal regulators have sort of reiterated this fact multiple times that banks can and should create these programs to address those historical gaps. And these programs could be for home ownership, it could be for small business development, it can even be for, one of the ones that we negotiated with US Bank was for a special purpose credit program to support emerging BIPOC-led affordable housing developers. So it could be really expansive and a really great tool to meet those credit needs. Other things in our CBAs include, metrics and targets for increased like mortgage origination, small business lending, expanded financial services, limits to overdraft fees, junk fees, outreach to particular communities like the Native American communities, support for affordable housing development, CDFIs. Increasingly, we've been including climate justice issues. So commitments from banks to not finance any more oil or gas companies or other forms of climate degradation. And then we also include, an accountability piece, which often takes the form of annual meetings with their CEO and their bank staff to monitor their progress and their lending. So this includes, organizing our members, getting data from the banks, and then seeing how well they're doing and, kind of holding them accountable for it. As I mentioned, as great as the CRA has been, and to the extent, we've been using it, there are definitely some gaps in the federal law. Maybe the most glaring one is that it focuses on income and not race. So this is our sort of premier anti-redlining law in the country, and yet its focus is on low to moderate income communities and not necessarily race. It also only covers banks. As folks know, the industry has transformed greatly. There are, independent mortgage companies who are originating more than a majority of home loans in California that are not covered by the CRA. Credit unions, fintech. There are a lot of these institutions that don't have a sort of reinvestment obligation, even though they operate in very similar ways. And there are also no downgrades for harm caused by banks. So investments that harm our climate, oil and gas companies financing them, that does not downgrade a bank's CRA rating. Lending to bad landlords, serial evictors, any kind of like displacement financing, these things don't harm or downgrade a bank's CRA rating. And rural communities are also pretty undervalued. Most major banks don't have physical presences in rural communities. And so CRA funds and attention are really limited in rural communities. And while we recognize community participation is critical, it's also not something that's valued by the federal regulators. They take public comment, but we see 96% of banks get passing grades. Most mergers are approved. And so that suggests to us that community input is not really valued by the regulators. And then there's also no real regulatory enforcement. So there's not a lot of like teeth to this law. To the point that even banks that redline are passing their CRA exams. So in the past 9 years, the DOJ has brought 17 redlining complaints against banks, and 13 of those banks passed their CRA exams, 11 got satisfactory ratings, and 2 even got outstanding ratings. And so this shows us that the federal CRA, as it stands, certainly before the updates to these rules, has a lot of gaps that leave lots of bad behavior unchecked. I think next up is Kevin to talk about the new rules.
Thanks, Doni. And maybe before getting into the new rules, just to say, like, this may seem like a lot of information. We're talking about the way the rules are currently. We're talking about the weaknesses in the rules. We're talking about how we use the rules despite their weaknesses to get these community benefits agreements. I'm going to talk about the new rules. We may talk about some other stuff if we have time. Maybe this is something that Doni would say at the end, but if you're at all interested in this or you have questions about it, then contact us, because we're very proud of the role that we play to hold banks accountable to communities. And we're only able to do that successfully because of our members and those who are working with us. So we are much stronger if there are other folks who are joining us. And I don't know if, Doni, did you want me to, I can kind of talk through. I probably would, unless, do we have time to, I didn't mean to, I was making it seem like I was cutting us off, but.
Oh, no. I just, if you were going to talk, I wanted, folks to be able to see you. So I can share the presentation.
Thanks. That's usually not effective to have like a good visual of me. Better to go with the slides. Thank you. Yeah. So, okay. So we've had these rules for a long time. They have not changed in a long time. There's been a lot of conversation about how the rules are outdated in some of the ways that Doni mentioned. And so there's been a several-year effort to revise, reform, update the new rules. We just went through this process, and we have new rules, 1,500 pages. The new rules were reflected, manifest in 1,500 pages. So there's a lot. We're going to try and give you like higher level, and hopefully it'll be good for your, for your purposes. If you have questions, we'll try and answer them. Maybe we can't, because I think there's still, there'll still be some questions as this rolls itself out. I'm going to start off by just giving some high level observations about the new rules. What has changed? So first off, the process that the regulators are going to use to evaluate banks, that's what all this is. How are the regulators going to evaluate banks? Are they serving communities? Which, to our point of view, is really the main thing, if not the only reason, that banks care to talk to all of us. So that may be overstating it, but we think, local governments, nonprofits, they are talking to us because of the Community Reinvestment Act, and because of how they think the regulators are going to look at their record of working with the community. The new rules create a more quantitative process. So there are metrics and benchmarks. It should lead to greater transparency, and we think it probably should lead to greater reinvestment. So that's like a main observation. In terms of the updating part, the way CRA has worked, it's really focused banks' obligations around where they have branches. So any bank that has a branch in the Inland Empire should be serving the Inland Empire. But if they don't, they probably not. So there was a recognition that maybe that's an old-fashioned idea and that banks work differently. So there is an effort to look at create obligations for banks to serve areas outside of their branches if they're doing a lot of lending there. So that's kind of new. An important part of the CRA evaluation process is looking at community development activities like support for affordable housing. And it seems like those in general, have been elevated under the new rules, with specifically, shout outs to native land areas and climate, which is referred to as weather resiliency. They kind of are highlighted, and we think those are great enhancements to the rules. And again, community development and lending are prioritized a bit more under the new rules, which will be more clear in the next slide. The regulators are going to look at how banks are serving customers through digital and online means. So that's newer, and that's a kind of a reflection of the updating of CRA. And most of those things I mentioned are generally positive. This last one is a negative. So they set thresholds for what is considered a small bank, an intermediate sized bank, and a large bank. And they kind of raised all those thresholds. So for smaller banks, which now include more banks are considered smaller because they raise the thresholds. Their obligations are lesser, and we think that's going to hurt rural communities. Next slide. I think this one is just, the test. So currently for large banks, and we're dealing mostly with large banks, which now are defined as 2 billion in assets or more. So probably most of the banks you talk with, but not all of the banks you talk with, are large banks. The test has been 50% of their evaluation is based on their lending, 25% based on investments, and 25% based on services like where they have branches. So now this is the new framework: 40% for retail lending, 40% for community development finance, 10% for a newer category called retail products and services, and 10% for community development services, which is like sitting on your boards. If you have a banker on your board, they count their hours and they report them, and now they'll report them under this community development services test. Next slide, please. Okay, so then here's some good things. We'll do good things, bad things, and then we'll move on. And Melanie, you should just tell us if we're kind of getting a time. Okay, you're shaking your head no. All right, so I mentioned earlier the lending test is more quantitative and rigorous. So there's actually kind of an initial assessment. Is a particular bank lending enough compared to other banks in a given area? And they might fail their assessment of serving a particular area if they're not doing enough. And that's kind of a new idea. Maybe that seems like that's obvious, but that's good. So there'll be a little bit tougher tests. Maybe we'll see less grade inflation. It will evaluate lending to low income instead of just a broader category of low and moderate, focusing on low income borrowers and very small businesses. So for us, this is a big win. We have talked about this for a long time. The CRA currently and previously really just looked at, were banks making loans of $1 million or less to small businesses? And those were considered small business loans. And a lot of our CDFI members, maybe some of you, I know this is a housing call, but maybe some work with small businesses. You don't think of $1 million business as a small business. And you can make $1 million loan, to like a $10 million business, and that would be considered a small business loan under the current CRA. So now there'll be a focus on, are you serving very small businesses? Great. I mentioned previously, community development calls out a few areas that we think are really important, and we're really excited to see. Native land areas, hopefully we'll see greater investment. Climate, weather resiliency, and community development financial institutions, really, I think, were big winners under the new CRA rules. They're, in many ways, they're kind of like preferred. There's also an assessment of whether banks' activities have an impact, and if they're meeting an impact and responsiveness test, where the regulators identify 12 particular areas of impact and responsiveness. And included amongst that are CDFIs, grant making, serving, I think that's like poverty, areas with extreme poverty, and low income housing tax credits, which is important to remember for a second. If you remember that previous chart, reads this new retail products and services test, seems actually pretty interesting. It only gets 10% of the total grade. But it has a lot of stuff that we all probably care about, like if banks are doing particularly good things with their customers, like providing language access services or making small dollar loans, which is a big need. So people don't have to go to payday lenders and pay 400%. And as Doni mentioned, special purpose credit programs. This was a bit of a win too. It gets a call out. If you're doing special purpose credit programs, you get credit under CRA. So that's new. And so then this is our last kind of like, in our assessment, we think there'll be more retail lending and more community development, and maybe it'll be more impactful under the new rules than currently. Next slide is, we had the good, this is probably the bad. If we probably going the other way. Yeah, what's bad? So Doni pointed out, CRA is really, it's been about giving credit for doing good things. It's not really about penalizing for doing bad things. That's still basically the case. There's no significant downgrading for harm, and banks can still close branches. There's been a lot of branch closings. There's not much the CRA has to say about that, which seems wrong. We thought maybe we had a win around displacement. We thought we were educating the regulators that some lending can result in the foreseeable displacement of low-income people or people of color. And there was some language in the rule, but in looking at it a little bit more closely, we see it's a very narrow definition of displacement, which we think, I would say, is probably will have almost no effect. So we'll still see lending by banks in low and moderate income areas that maybe foreseeably, or at least results in the displacement of low income people, and those loans will likely have gotten CRA credit. So that's a problem. We had hoped that the rules would be an opportunity to elevate the community participation aspect of CRA that Doni mentioned. So all this is about serving community credit needs. Who determines what the needs are? It seems like it should be the community. And so community input should be important. There's really this was a letdown. The final rules don't really do more to enhance community input. This is a very specific point which might be of interest to the affordable housing developers. And we heard a lot about this during the rulemaking process. So you won't remember, but the way that it is now, there's a lending test and an investment test, which has the effect of creating a an incentive for banks to do low-income housing tax credits, because there's a special test for investments, and low-income housing tax credits is an investment that gets credit. The new rules kind of smushes those categories together. There's no separate investment test. There's a community development test. And we are concerned that this may have the effect of reducing the incentive for banks to do low-income housing tax credits. They've made some accommodations. We made these comments on the proposed rule, and they heard it. They kept the smushing part, but they added a few extra things to say that they're going to look at it. They're going to track for large banks whether they're doing low-income housing tax credits and other investments to see if they learn if they messed up in the way that we think they might have. And they're also giving credit for tax credits in this like impact and responsiveness test. As I mentioned, there are less obligations for smaller banks. And a lot of the new requirements are for the very big banks over $2 billion. So that's not great. And then the race issue, we could go on for a long time about. I mean, I would say in terms of like our high level message about, what do we take from the rule? Number one, huge disappointment because we thought it was going to address race in a meaningful way, and it does not. And yet we still think it's on the whole positive, that it will lead to more investment in low-income communities, hopefully also in communities of color. And maybe I'll leave it there. And if people are interested in how and why we're so frustrated and disappointed by what the rule says about race, we can talk about that separately. But just in the interest of time, maybe we can move to the next. And I think the next is, okay, so what now? Basically, so the rule is supposed to take effect, most of the provisions on January 1st, 2026, but people may have heard the bank sued. So there's now a lawsuit. They're challenging the new rule. And I just have been kind of focused on this. The ABA, American Bankers Association, says we strongly support and appreciate the goals of the Community Reinvestment Act, but we're going to sue to stop the rules. So that's where we are. Things are kind of tied up in court. We don't know how long it will take to get resolved. We don't know how it will be resolved. We suspect it will survive. But as a related matter, we are very focused on this dynamic, and we may come back to you all through an email to Melanie and maybe the list for support in us trying to hold accountable all of the banks that are part of these trade associations that are suing to stop the CRA, that are suing to stop the HMDA rule for small businesses, Section 1071, that are suing to kill the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that are suing to stop climate-friendly policies, including we have these two bills that passed our legislature that are landmark, that are these disclosure bills, which really are transformational. And the California Chamber is suing to stop those. The California Chamber and all of these trade associations are comprised of, I would say almost every bank is a member of one or more of these associations, and several banks are on the boards of these trade associations. So we do not want to allow them to continue to say, no, we're with you, Inland SoCal Housing Collective and all your members. We care about housing counseling and home ownership, and we're for the CRA, and we're against discrimination, and we believe in climate change, and yet we are not going to do anything when our trade associations in our name sue to stop and destroy all those things. That it can't be. So we're trying to figure out next steps on that. One last thing I'll say before turning back to Doni is another thing that we will come back to you on. So this is a lot of information, but maybe you remember, maybe you were interested in one of Doni's earlier slides about the community benefits agreement. Almost $100 billion we're getting banks to commit to California communities. That's really leveraging like what we have, the CRA and the bank merger process. Currently, one of the banking regulators is starting to think about what changes do we need to the bank merger process. It's a really important opportunity for us to insert the community voice into these conversations. And we're going to we're probably going to do a sign-on letter, and we will come back to you with the sign-on letter to start bulking up the bank merger process so we can do even a better job in getting even stronger community benefits agreements. And with that, maybe I'll turn it back to Doni for like final remarks, concluding. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And I just wanted to wrap up with a discussion around our idea for a state level community reinvestment act. As Kevin mentioned, the federal CRA isn't perfect. There are these efforts to modernize it and to reform it. But even with those efforts, these new rules, there are gaps in the federal law that could be filled with a state level policy. And so we've been working to think through how that can work. And the vision for this kind of state level CRA is one that would extend coverage, this affirmative obligation to meet credit needs of communities to credit unions, the independent mortgage companies, fintech. This kind of state CRA would also consider whether these institutions are serving BIPOC borrowers and communities, something that meaningfully addresses race and includes race in the assessment of financial institutions. This law would be able to require financial institutions to serve all areas of their state, including rural communities, providing access to products and investments in those communities. We tailor it to downgrade them for harm, things like, as we mentioned, financing of fossil fuels, displacement, or fee gouging through overdraft fees, not sufficient fees, and elevating community input, and also consequences for poor ratings. This could be barring them from being able to merge, open up new branches, apply for licenses, or accept state deposit or other public monies. Right. And this kind of state CRA policy framework is not particularly novel in that other states have established similar frameworks, some variation of a CRA at the state level, including Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, DC, and several other states. And when we're thinking about the rationale behind, the state CRA and the inclusion of these institutions like state charter banks, credit unions, IMCs, and fintech, some of the thinking around that comes from the fact that, one, we are in a state of dire need for increased funding for affordable housing community development in California. And based off of our CBAs and the share of deposits that banks have committed to reinvest through our CBAs, our research has it that state charter banks and credit unions could have the potential to reinvest upwards of $15 billion per year for affordable housing and economic development. So a lot of funding that could go towards, affordable housing, home ownership, small business development, and other forms of community economic development. And some of the rationales I mentioned for the inclusion of these institutions is that, one, the industry has changed since the CRA was first passed. And a lot of these institutions are increasingly taking on the roles of traditional banks in lending and holding deposits or originating mortgages. These institutions are also benefiting from some form of government funding, right? So credit unions benefit from being tax exempt as nonprofits. They have some additional public supports. And with this kind of public support, there is no community reinvestment obligation. They're also charging the most in non-sufficient funds and overdraft fees. When we look at independent mortgage companies, they are relying on government-insured loans and originate to sell models to government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to support their business models. So again, relying on public funds and public support to support their business models without any kind of reinvestment obligations. And then when we look at state chartered banks, as we know, Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic Bank. These are state-chartered banks that failed in the past year. These failures are suggesting that perhaps greater regulatory oversight that a state CRA could provide, the DFPI, for example, is actually needed to ensure that they are stable enough to serve their communities. And so this is a policy framework we've been working on. I'll share a policy brief on this, and then of course we'll share our emails if folks are interested in supporting these efforts and wanting to learn more. And last thing I wanted to add, huge departure from CRA, but a very important campaign that we've been working on. And I mentioned this was actually the presentation I gave last month, which was on our LLC owner transparency bill. We have a bill number. It's been introduced. It's SB 1201 with Senator DeRosso. And I just wanted to share the sign-on again for folks, if folks are interested in supporting our effort to bring more transparency in the ownership of housing and businesses in California, protecting consumers, employees, and also tenants from anonymous LLCs. And then also folks have any stories of anonymous LLCs impacting your work. We are really eager to collect those stories. There's been some media attention on this bill, and so we'd love to pitch a report as if folks have any of those examples. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Melanie if there's any time for Q&A.
Yeah, we could have, if there is any questions, we could take a minute or two to ask those.
Well, I'll start. Hey, Kevin, long time.
Yeah, hope you're doing well.
Doing all right. Yeah, I did notice this last year that we did see an aggressive outreach from U.S. Bank. And I'm sure that was a result of their enhanced CRA commitment with the Union Bank merger. How is this doing? Because you did mention grants in the deck. How is this impacting the banks? Because it's only 10%, and then it's only a part of the 10%. It looks like when I looked at it, when it went by on the slide, is that all that is that portion being used for the CRA, or is that not being touched in the new rules going forward?
It's a good question. On the last part first, I'm not sure the new rules create any more incentive or less incentive to do grants. Grants were always kind of like, they're really a very small part of any bank CRA, and they weren't particularly called out before, like currently, I guess. I keep thinking before, but they're under the current rules. So maybe that's one that remains to be seen, but I don't see any red flags. To your earlier point, I think you just like that was you just made that's like an advertisement for you all to join us in our advocacy, because we had a big campaign against US Bank. We opposed their merger with Union Bank. We got hearings from the regulators, and then while we were negotiating a community benefits agreement with them, which was $60 billion for California, which we hope has something to do with them outreaching in the Inland Empire. And in a way, those are related things, but different. So they have their CRA people, and they're going to make sure they know the rules, and they're going to be ready to submit to the regulators, hopefully a good report that shows they're doing their best under the community. But we have our own community benefits agreement with them, and that exists separately. So even if the rules change, the agreement is the same. And how is that going, which I think is part of what you asked? We think it's going pretty well. We're going to be meeting with them, and these are the kinds of meetings and conversations that we rely on our members to have, to be part of with us, to not only, as Doni mentioned, negotiate these agreements when we can, which is usually during merger, but also to have the accountability piece where the bank agrees to meet with us, hopefully the CEO. I think we're meeting with the CEO of US Bank coming up, and we want to be able to, and we ask them, of all the things you told us you're doing, are you doing them? and have our members say, yeah, we're seeing that, or we're not. So if you're interested, please continue to join us, or join us for the first time. We'd love to have you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Melinda.
I'm Melinda Opperman, credit.org. It's nice to see Doni again. I just saw him last week. And Kevin, it's great to see you. I had an opportunity to hear Doni speak last week. We were at the Fair Housing Laws and Litigation Conference, and there wasn't enough time for me to ask a question. The topic of no meaningful inclusion of race was really important to us at the Fair Housing Laws and Litigation Conference. They are, in these new rules, able to engage in non-credit discrimination, I read, can fail to serve 39% of areas and still pass. We're very concerned regarding that, regarding underserved communities and races and ethnicities, the gentrification of neighborhoods based on this MSA zip code method. Can you elaborate on that?
I can try. Yeah, so I made the mistake of, I was sick. I couldn't make the conference. Doni went in. I've been going to that conference and asked to come like for 25 years. I think that's the last time they're going to invite me. So I guess I'll always have the prior 25. Yeah, you highlight I think I didn't cover those in this discussion, but those key aspects. So the regulators are acting like, no, we did address race because we said special purpose credit programs count, and those are usually has some race component. And there's a new thing which we didn't talk about because I think it's a joke. They're saying for the CRA evaluations, which no one but a few of us read, they're going to include new tables on using the HMDA data, which will show lending by race. So you can see in Citibank's performance evaluation in 8 years whether they lent to Latino borrowers in the Inland Empire. If they didn't, it's not going to affect their CRA exam. That's the whole point. So we're saying CRA, the exam is looking at whether banks are serving low and moderate income people and small businesses and small farms. It should do the same for people of color, neighborhoods of color. They said no. And then, as you pointed out, in the proposed rule, so it's like a process, they proposed the rule. And in the proposal, they said, one thing we'll do is we'll say, if someone tries to open up a bank account and they don't get their bank account because they're Black, because they were discriminated against because they're Black, because they were treated improperly, that's not going to affect their CRA. The proposal was that should result in a downgrade. That would be discrimination for CRA purposes. And in the final rule, they took that out. They said, no, we're not going to touch. If there's lending discrimination, it'll be a factor. That's been the case. There's no change there. But the proposal was, if you're discriminated based on a non-credit transaction, like opening a bank account, and in a minute I'm going to turn to Doni to elaborate on that, on how hypothetical that situation is. And then the other thing you mentioned was they're looking at how banks are doing in each of their assessment areas, which could be counties. Okay, so for larger banks, they'll have a number of counties, and they may fail in some of the counties and do well in other counties. Okay, so then there's got to be some balancing, but they're saying you can fail to serve 39% of your counties and still get a passing grade, and we say that's not acceptable. So for all these reasons, we huge lost opportunity, not necessarily a step backwards, but we're in the same place on race essentially, except for special purpose credit programs, and there's going to be HMDA data we can give you HMDA data if you're interested, if Citibank's lending in the Inland Empire. So now it'll be, and then maybe there's no time, but I don't know if Doni in a minute can talk about what does that non-credit discrimination look like?
Yeah, I wanted to add, as part of our work to maybe folks are familiar with Cal account. It is what we're proposing as a fee-free debit account. available to all Californians. It's currently going through its feasibility study, and to support this, we conducted, along with our partners at SEIU, we conducted a mystery shopper project where we sent in folks to various banks throughout California to ask for a fee-free debit account, a low-cost debit account. And we were tracking based off of the race ethnicity of the shopper and also the language spoken. So there are 5 different languages spoken. It was like English, Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese. I think, yeah, those were the 4 languages. And as you can imagine, and I was helping folks like debrief their sessions, taking the experiences from their visits. Lots of folks sharing, one, they were not even being, they were denied almost the ability to speak with bankers. They had to make appointments to even ask simple questions. They had to provide identification to ask questions. And folks that were Spanish speakers, folks that were BIPOC were expressing this kinds of almost a denial or discrimination in their visits. And then if they were to even have conversations with bankers or tellers, they were often presented more costly bank accounts. So very rarely, if ever, were they given that low cost account that they were asking for. So it's, as Kevin said, it's not this, hypothetical experiences of discrimination. It's very real, and we're seeing it firsthand.
Well, I want to thank you guys for your time. I know we're 3 minutes out from end. So normally we do a quick pillar update time, but I think it can be I feel like we don't have enough time to do that well enough. But anyone here, I do invite you to attend any of our pillar meetings. Our Educate and Advocate is the first Tuesday of every month from 10 to 11. This next month, we're going to be talking about some new policy, putting it through our policy matrix to see if this is something that we want to support or add to our policy agenda. We'll be going through that tool. In our wealth building and preservation, as well as in our Bank on Coalition, a lot of our work is in discussion. We'll be continuing to prepare for our forum, as well as some sub-working groups in our expansion of housing solutions. We're working on a number of things, but we have an affordable housing mixture that is now, we have a date, March 28th. Mark on your calendars. It was included, if you got this, the newsletter that came out this morning, 6:10, it should have come out in your mailbox. It has a total list of all these upcoming updates and events that the collective is hosting and curating. It is a busy couple months, so please review that, put those on your calendar, and look for registration links and information if you want to attend any of those events. And it's an array of affordable housing, bank on, faith-based housing convening around SB4. So take a look at all of those, and we look forward to engaging and interacting with you guys there, as well as in any of the working groups. We also have, I just saw this, and we also have a California mortgage relief event that'll be happening in High Desert on March 16th. So any of our collective members out there, I'll be reaching out to you, sending you some flyer information to help get the word out to folks who are in foreclosure or need some homeowner retention counseling. We'll have some folks out there doing some walk-in information session and walk-in appointments on March 16th on Saturday. So I'll be sticking around if there's any questions, but thank you everyone for joining, and I look forward to seeing you at another event or meeting later this month. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. Happy
All right.
birthday.
Thanks.
Birthday.
Thank
Happy
you.
birthday.